Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Real American History. I'm your host, Tess Evans, public historian. And for this episode, I'm going to be talking about the United States factory system. And I'm not talking about industrialization type factories, but rather a system that has trade at its core. But I'll give you a little bit of background first. So in 1803, we know that Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from the French for $15 million, what we now call the Louisiana Purchase. So there was this wide swath of land that was basically, to the English anyway, to Jefferson and whatnot, uninhabited, except by natives, which we know were there. And so Jefferson, of course, wanted this area explored, and so he sends Meriwether Lewis and William Clark in their famous Lewis and Clark expedition. So there's a lot of exploration going on. And Lewis and Clark come across a lot of natives, they build relationships, and eventually they start what is known as the factory system. So it was actually established in 1795 under George Washington and was later, of course, expanded into Thomas Jefferson's administration. The factory system actually derives its name from the English common law definition of a factor, which was a person who buys and sells on behalf of an employer. And the purpose of this factory system here in America was to trade quality goods at a price that was affordable to the Native American tribes in the area in order to establish good relations with them. And there were actually a total of 28 factories and sub-factories in the South and in the Midwest. So there was one in particular called Fort Osage that is in northwest Missouri that was actually built under the direction of William Clark. He was, of course, the joint commander of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And in 1808, Fort Osage was built as a military post in this newly acquired Louisiana Territory. So the fort's purpose specifically was to provide military presence in the area to assure that Spain, France, and Great Britain, entities who were also in the area and had a lot of economic input, that the United States meant to protect its territory through strength and through trade with the Native American population. So what really is at the core of this factory system is to try to prevent any type of warfare with Native Americans, while also establishing trade, commerce, making profits off the land, and of course encouraging the westward expansion and movement from people from the east to settle out in this western area. And Thomas Jefferson actually wrote one of many, many letters and instructions to Meriwether Lewis, and there's one in particular here, I'll quote, "In all your intercourse with the natives, treat them in the most friendly and conciliatory manner which their own conduct will permit." End quote. That was in 1803. But Jefferson was pretty much saying, be nice to the Native Americans and you won't have warfare in return. You'll have this nice mutual relationship. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But there was another letter that Jefferson sent to his Secretary of War in 1808, saying that Jefferson didn't want the British setting up trading posts west of the Mississippi River, and, quote, not permit them to send out individual traders to the Indian towns, end quote. So he didn't want any kind of competition from other traders. There were a lot of independent traders, like fur traders, who were trying to make a lot of money in the area as well, who weren't working with the government, who weren't working with the American government. And so that presented a lot of competition, and I'll speak to that again at the end here. And so the government again, sincerely hope that the Native Americans would appreciate the services that these factories provided, meaning there was a lot of items that the white men thought that the natives could use, and in exchange, of course, the natives brought in mostly furs. That was a huge part of this trading system. That was a massive commodity. And they would, of course, again, show their appreciation by refraining from any type of war. And in the case of Fort Osage, there wasn't any violence on the fort property. There were a couple of incidences and one maybe threat, but at least Fort Osage was not one of the forts of the 28 in America that was attacked. And, the relationships between the whites and the Native Americans was basically pretty frazzled. So there were rules to this trade, this camaraderie between whites and Native Americans. If the natives did not abide by the rules set by these factories, then trade goods were withheld. Meriwether Lewis wrote to Thomas Jefferson saying that the government withheld goods from the Osage Indians around Fort Osage, which is who the fort is actually named after. But the goods were withheld and, quote, were reduced in the course of a few months to a state of perfect submission without bloodshed. He's speaking about the Native Americans. He continues, quote, "This has, in my opinion, fairly proven the superiority which the policy of withholding merchandise from the Indians has over the chastisement of the sword." So basically it was a punishment. If the Native Americans didn't get along with the whites, they caused any type of warfare, then they would not get the goods that they wanted to trade. And the goods were actually sold slightly above cost, and the natives actually had to purchase these items on credit. So it wasn't a cash exchange. And one of the major consequences of the United States factory system is that the government used the factory system to civilize, what they call civilize, the Native Americans and forced them to give up more of their land. Because the natives purchased these goods on credit, and since, like I alluded to earlier, animal furs were the most profitable item that they could sell or trade, if the natives didn't get enough furs to cover the credit, they were left in loads amounts of debt, which often happened. And to wipe out this debt, though, the government would renegotiate treaties with the natives and essentially taking more land from the Native Americans. To pay off that debt, they were just going to have to concede more of their land to the whites. And that's exactly what happened. Now, the decline of the United States factory system, which ended about between 1822 and 1827, was attributed basically to the lack of familiar staff. So anybody who was working within, this entire trade system, the factory system, they weren't familiar enough with Native American trade or government relations and or budget restrictions. And they had to deal with a lot of that as well from the government. There was kind of this lack of incentives for the factor to increase trade under, their own management and control. And the biggest hindrance to these factory systems, though, was the competition from private traders. There were men who ran basically their own companies and basically ran these factories out of commission, out of business. And there were some private traders who actually had some greater flexibility because they were able to travel easily between Native American villages, and they also worked with other private traders and also some of these men married into Native American families, which kind of further solidifies their commercial relationships. So, all in all, the United States factory system was very short-lived, but it was the culmination of a desire to get along with the Native Americans while the white men were pushing west and settling. There were a lot of land grabs at this time. A lot of government was selling off land that was conceded by the Native American tribes. And from there, you just have this major swath of people moving into the area, and also coming in this area with the thought of, we need to civilize these, quote, savages, is what they were called, what the Native Americans were called quite a bit. And, the whites thinking that they needed to civilize them and convert them to Christianity and teach them, the ways of the English white men, and assimilate their children, and basically become citizens. And of course, though, there were, like I've said in this episode, many, many reasons why the Native Americans were forced from their lands, different treaties, whatnot. And so the factory system honestly kind of worked against the Native Americans because of the debt situation and the fact that in order to get rid of that debt, they would just have to give up more of their own lands, their own hunting grounds, and it just made everything a lot harder. Trade became harder. There was still, of course, a lot of warfare, and things got pretty bad during the War of 1812 as well for a lot of these factories. Fort Osage, for instance, had to be evacuated, and from about 1812, 1813 to about 1815, they actually had to find a different place to trade with the Native Americans just because warfare was so bad during that war. So that is the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed learning about the United States factory system. And if you would like to subscribe, just hit that button. If you have any comments, questions, any thoughts for future episodes, just email me at realahistory@gmail.com. And until then, I hope you share these videos as well and show people what you've learned. And until next time, I will see you with some new content. Bye.